Welcome back, guys, to episode 4 of Cases and Cocktail. I'm here today again with my beautiful wife, Janice. I'm here with Sandra Aguilar, and today our special guest is Loretta Maase. Loretta, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and hanging out with us today. I hear recently you may or may not have had a birthday.
I did.
Nice. Nice. Well, thank you for coming. I think this is your birthday week, so we appreciate you spending that time with us. Tell us, what role do you play in the parental alienation field?
Well, I have several hats in the field, but focusing exclusively on parental alienation field, I'm a therapist. So I provide treatment and therapy, reunification therapy in an intensive setting and also in a family therapy setting. I also provide forensic evaluations across the country. I'm in most states. Now, those are comprehensive forensic file reviews. And I do quite a lot of parent coaching, target parent coaching. Parents call up and say, I think this is parental alienation. They may be just now discovering it or have been in litigation for 10 years. And so they want to know about what their options are in terms of evaluations and treatment.
And are you a licensed professional counselor, or
I am.
Any other awesome credentials?
Mother.
I believe
Absolutely.
I was going to say, I
Grandmother.
believe the two of them are going to agree that might be the most important
Yeah.
one overall. Tell me a little bit why and how long parental alienation?
Why? It's something that I got pulled into right during graduate school in the 90s,
Okay.
working with high conflict families. I helped create some divisions in the New Mexico. We called it court clinic back then. Created the first, what is now, I think they call it Wise People, but it's parent facilitation. So I helped create that way back then. And somehow or other, I stumbled into that by accident. And then I have just lived in that world, not intentionally, it just seemed to be a good fit.
Yeah.
And then got pulled into it in a very high profile case about maybe 10 years ago or so, and have been deeply involved ever since.
Cool. Tell me, I know that you and I have talked about cases in the past.
Correct.
And we're not going to talk about those specific
Okay.
cases, but it's cases and cocktails. So I do want to talk a little bit about how some of these parental alienation cases, what role you play in them, and how you help people, kind of navigate that. But let's talk a little bit though about your approach to parental alienation. There's different approaches to it. I assume you follow the 5-factor model, or do you follow something different?
The 5-factor model is simply a fairly new way of looking at tools that we've used for a very long time.
Right.
So it's just an organized way for us to say that there's a child rejection, they had a relationship, there's no abuse, there are alienating behaviors, and there are manifestations of alienation in the children. But that's just a new terminology I follow also, which came prior to it, was Dr. Salvador Minuchin, who's considered the father of family therapy, talked about in the 50s and 60s, is triangulation in family relationships. So he identified in children that were on their deathbeds, basically in the hospital, he identified that what was the causal factor in these issues these children came into the hospital with was triangulation between what we call cross-generational triangulation or coalition, where a parent would enlist a child in a coalition against the other parent. And so that was identified way before parental alienation was
You
even.
said the 50s, the 60s?
Yeah, Dr. Salvador Minuchin, who happened to be the trainer of my trainer, and she was a right-hand therapist alongside him in treatment centers back on the East Coast. And they discovered, this is where family therapy came from, they discovered that these cross-generational coalitions between a parent and a child against another parent were literally physically killing these children. They were dying from anorexia, from suicide. And so he identified that. And that's where the whole concept of alienation came from and the treatment modalities came from, is how do you restructure those relationships. And
Right.
so the 5-factor model is a organizing way of looking at what we've known about for decades.
And I love that you said it that way, because that's the way, you know, that's the way we approach it. We approach a lot of these cases as data. And in fact, I think all family law cases are just data driven. But the five factor model allows you to have a construct of how to do that, right? You collect the data, then you organize it, and that way you can present it right to someone, and they can see sort of how that data applies to the situation or the case at hand.
Correct. And being in the kind of the label that we use, a specialist in this area, the five-factor model is only an organizing container.
Right.
There's much, much more that goes into it than just identifying rejection and the other four factors. That's
Right.
much more that goes into it. But that at least gives us common terminology and what to look for, baseline of what to look like. So for people just beginning to have work in this field, there's some structure,
Right.
but in that structure is a very, very deep reservoir of skills and knowledge and ways of identifying that go way beyond the five factors.
Right. Do you, I want you to talk a little bit about parental alienation in the DSM-5, because I think, that's sort of what we're talking about. And we come from a context of litigation, right? And I just told you my presentation is to do it, put together the data to present it in court. But I think there's other avenues for this. Talk a little bit about parental alienation and the DSM-5 for us.
Okay, so I'll give the context for that question.
Right.
We get asked that a lot.
Yeah.
The question is parental alienation in the DSM-5, and definitively yes it is. And in, I believe, the November 2023, last November, Dr. Bill Burnett, who is president of the Parent Alienation Study Group, PASG, published a letter from the director of the DSM-5 and the steering committee that did the DSM-5 and DSM-5-TR.
Okay.
And the question he posed to them, they were debating whether or not they were going to use the language parental alienation. It had been close to being put in there over the years. Dr. Burnett didn't want it to be put in there for some reasons at some point, until they had an organizing structure like the five-factor model.
The five-factor, yeah.
So he asked, was discussing this topic with the director of the steering committee. And this doctor, and his name escapes me, he sent a letter that defines where it is in the DSM-5 and how to use it. And he said, absolutely, it's in the DSM-5. It's broken down into different diagnostic categories in the DSM-5. The first one is under parent-child relational problems. And the second, another one is child affected by parental relationship distress, and parent and psychological maltreatment. We also look when we're using when we're looking at the probability for finding for parental alienation, we look at delusional disorder in children in relationship to somebody who has a delusional disorder. That's a diagnostic delusional traits in the relationship. And then we look at children with identity disturbance in relationship to a parent with coercive control. Okay. So there are many different areas in the DSM-5, but to look at the PAI, Parental Alienation International magazine 2023, is the actual letter from the director of the DSM-5, and it explains some of that.
Explains all of it, that sort of stuff. Tell me, just real fast, you said something about psychological maltreatment as part of the DSM-5. Is that part of one of the diagnostic tools?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see that a lot?
Is in cases of, well, in all cases to some degree, in cases of severe, yes, it's when you look at the five-factor model, parental alienation is the foundation of factor 4, which is alienating behaviors. And so when you look at the alienating behaviors, they're built on the psychological maltreatment, which is to threaten harm or threaten the relationship of a child, important relationships of that child. In other words, that they withhold contact, they badmouth that other parent, and that is in a way threatening their relationship with another person that they're bonded to. And psychological maltreatment, just real briefly, is a very important subject. there's a lot of research beginning with the adverse childhood experiences studies, which we call ACE studies, which were done for over 50, now 60 years by the Department of Health and Human Services,
Okay.
and looked at. There are some studies done under that umbrella that show that psychological maltreatment is as damaging to children as is physical abuse and sexual abuse. It's such a serious situation. So when a parent comes to us and says that they're someone they're working with, guardian ad litem, whatever, recognizes that it's psychological maltreatment, but they don't see it as child abuse.
Right.
You have to stop and just change the word. Well, if you were looking at molestation, would that be considered child abuse? If this is as bad as sexual abuse and physical abuse, just change out the word and you'll see what you need to do in this case.
Right.
I'm still regularly surprised about how often I go into court and I use the words parental alienation, and judges look at me as if I'm crazy, or they don't understand it. They've never heard it in their courtroom before. If this is something, at least from a therapeutic perspective, that's been being talked about since the 50s and 60s, what, if any, is your opinion on why the disconnect?
Well, that's a good question. Training is slow. And we look at the research that's been done in parental alienation, and it's gone through its infancy stages, and now it's in, I believe it's called the greening stage, where there's been so much research done that verifies, validates the presence of the DSM-5.
Right.
Now it's more of the application. Most of that research done has been done since 2016. So the majority, this is the problem with some of the work that's being done, is the majority of what we have and we know is 8 years old, that research. So if your training as a judge or a lawyer goes back 8 years, you probably don't have really, you're not steeped in
Right.
the majority of our training on
Right.
parental alienation and the really intensive research that's been done on it. Also, there's been we have some articles out on this, quite a lot of information on this. There's been some malpractice in terms of research that's been done where the researchers have changed some of the critical language in what the DSM-5 says or what Dr. Gardner says about PA, parental alienation. They changed some of that language and then reinvented a definition for it. So having changed the language, like parental alienation must have this or could have this, changing very simple words in it,
Right.
set off a whole new track of research that changed whether or not it's accepted as valid scientific research or not. So there's just a lot of politics that goes on in the definition, and that's why there's training that judges have had and received that is not based on the depth of the science that's available, and that's one of the problems. Either they were trained before, or they haven't been trained at all, trained before, or it's been on some misinformation.
What's a good way if someone finds themselves in a courtroom like that? What do you think, or what would you suggest is the best way, mid litigation in a case, to explain to the judge what this is?
I know of no other way because I do this, daily. I know of no other way than to have a real specialist in the research. And when I talk about research, I talk about the research that meets all of the Daubert criteria for admissibility. It has to be valid. It has to meet all of those standards. So it's rigorous. It can be duplicated and done in other environments. It's received general acceptance level. So research that is valid is a very important thing to get before the judges and to educate them on. So I would say having an expert in the science and the research about what's out there, and there's a lot of it. So educating the court, have somebody in there who really truly understands the research and getting before the judge.
If you could give one piece of advice to a parent who feels like they're being alienated, what would it be?
Not to take one piece of advice.
Fair. That's
It's
fair.
a complex answer,
Yeah,
and we
yeah.
get calls from parents every single day who after talking, well, say, well, you're the first person that I've ever met that understands what I'm talking about.
Right.
And so I will tell them first and foremost, you better have an attorney who understands it, because you do not want an attorney with on the job training to deal with such a complex problem.
What I think, first of all, I think that's important because you can do whatever you want, but unless you, and that's really what I think Janice was getting to, is if you, unless you present it to the court, um, what would you consider to be an attorney that understands it, or a good attorney in this field?
Well, like I said, an attorney who is not doing on the job training, somebody who's seasoned, who understands that litigating parental alienation is a uphill battle because of the judges, because of the courts, because there's going to be counter experts who bring in misinformation. It's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
It is a raging war to litigate when it comes to people's children, and those
Yeah.
children have been weaponized. So it is an uphill battle. So an attorney who is seasoned, who is teachable, and then on some of the cases around the country that I'm on, they'll not have a lot of options back some community,
Right.
back, and so the question is your attorney willing to have an attorney come co-chair with you,
Right.
co-attorney? So are you teachable? Will you accept help of somebody who is an expert in doing this? But first and foremost, I think having an attorney who really understands it. And a lot of attorneys hang that shingle out that I do parent alienation cases. A 5-minute conversation, you'll know that they really have a very cursory understanding of it, not a very deep understanding. And then you would think, I need to move on.
Move on
Yeah.
to somebody else.
Yeah. I want to just jump really quick, kind of backwards a little bit, because you really identified where it is in the DSM. But I think people are looking for the actual term, parental alienation. And I think sometimes people get stuck on that. Is that actual term in the DSM 5?
It's not in the DSM-5 as of now, or DSM-5 TR as of now that I understand it. It is, however, the two authors who wrote the chapter where these diagnoses are, Wambold and Narrow, Dr. Wambold, Dr. Narrow, and then Dr. Bill Burnett, who's my colleague. They wrote an article on the DSM-5 and where parental alienation is in there. That language is in their article. So again, they're the authors of the DSM-5 chapter. In their supplemental article, they do identify specifically alienation and loyalty conflicts in their expounding on one of their criteria in the DSM.
Right. And so the reason why I wanted to go back to that question was because I think sometimes in the courtroom, when you get called in as an expert, opposing counsel can often get stuck on trying to get you to say, no, it's not, or trying to keep you as an expert from giving the appropriate definition on where a clinician can find that information. And so that's why I think that's really important for other people who might be watching and listening in, and other professionals who are in our field as a LPC, to be able to understand that, yeah, the actual term may not be in there yet, but there is enough criteria and traits that you can identify and still give a diagnosis of what is happening to the child and what they're experiencing, and also how that impacts them. And so I was really glad to hear you mention the ACE studies, because that is something that's really important for also your legal team to understand and have that knowledge.
Right, and all of the research. And we do not use that terminology, a diagnosis of parental alienation, for various reasons. We look at probabilities and findings consistent with the diagnoses in the DSM-5. And you can't deny when like I do a forensic file review and I find 500 examples of evidence of alienating behaviors and the 8 manifestations of alienation in children, you find that concretely, it's easy enough to say, well, these behaviors are consistent with psychological maltreatment. These behaviors are consistent with parent-child relational problems. So you can easily align with that without using that specific terminology. Also, I want to point out that I think it was 90 years before the term PTSD was used. There was, do you remember way back when? You're probably too young, but way back when it was shell shock.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
years, and there are so many things that we accept now in the terminology that took decades for it to be included in the DSM-5. We're going through that process with
Right.
the terminology of alienation.
That's the greening process you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Sort of still vetting, kind of, and now you're applying it, right? So you've done the research. Now we're doing application to it and kind of working through that. Is that right?
Correct.
Did I nail that?
Exactly.
I nailed
Yes,
it.
you got it.
See, Sandra, I was listening. I told you.
Thank you.
I want to
You're
talk.
teachable.
I am. Yes. When you start at the bottom of intelligence, you have to really be teachable in order to kind of make your way up.
Especially when you sit with three women.
I tell you, I know that I'm not the smartest human at this table. I can tell you that. I want to talk a little bit because you said that oftentimes, you'll have parents call you, and I assume it runs the gamut, right? Of, I think it's happening, it might be happening, it's totally happening, it's been happening for a long time, and I don't know what to do. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell me, how do you tell them first, okay, hey, you go get a good legal team, right? But then what's your steps? What are the things that you do to kind of then triage and figure out where they're at in that, in their journey, right? So you can start to help them.
So when parents call, they want to talk.
Yeah.
They really just want to know that you hear them, but they're hurting and they want to talk. So you listen and you listen and you listen. And from there, you get some understanding of what the issues are. And after I let them talk, I ask them questions about, how long has it been? What behaviors are you seeing? Then I run them through my own real quick assessment.
Right.
And that assessment is, so tell me, are there any CPS findings, any police reports? If I were to look into your background,
Right.
would I find any CPS involvement? Would I find any arrests for domestic violence? Anything in there? And oftentimes they'll say, yes, I just finished an investigation, or I'm in the middle of one because I have my 10th false allegation, and every one of them has been ruled out
Right.
or unable to determine. And so we talk about that for a bit. And I always include, how about domestic violence? Have there been any arrests? Have there
Right.
been any of those issues that will be a flag to me to say, well, maybe this is not parental alienation. Maybe this is a justifiable rejection case. And so I run them through the 5-factor model,
Right.
basically. So what's
Fair.
your
Yeah.
child doing?
Right.
What was it like
Before.
before?
Any outstanding circumstances or reasons why to
Right.
justify it, right?
So
And
yeah,
then,
and yeah.
then the manifestations and the behaviors.
Well, and the behaviors, the manifestations.
yeah.
It's critical for people to understand behaviors always come before the manifestations. And that's how Dr. Gardner was able to identify that children who are alienated have a consistent pattern of behaviors, is that he first noticed that the parents were doing things
The same
that were
behaviors.
psychological maltreatment,
Yeah.
a bad mouthing the other parent, etc. So I run them through my own cursory 5-factor model without identifying that's what I'm doing,
Right.
and get their information. And then I ask questions like, so tell me what I would find in the discovery that the other parent's going to say about you.
Right.
And tell me what's
What are
the
the- what are the
worst
skeletons?
thing.
Yeah,
What's the
yeah.
worst thing they're going to say about you? What are your kids alleging?
Right.
And I ask them, and I tell them at the same time. Now, if I were to look into your case, I have to tell you first and foremost, there's a real good chance I'm not going to find parental alienation. That
Right.
there is going to be something else there. So you should know that before you talk to me or anybody else who does the work that I do. There's a real good chance we're going to find out things that maybe look at that this is a child abuse case.
Right.
So now would be the time to disclose that.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's really good. Well, let me rephrase that. In every case that you look at or you review or you do a forensic file review, do you always find alienation?
I would say it used to be more of a 50-50. Half the time I wouldn't. It's in my paperwork that there's no guarantee of a finding.
Right.
I tell parents, I'm asking for your file, a complete and total file from both sides. Let me back up for just a moment, and before I forget this piece, I always tell them that, because judges and attorneys will say, how could it be a real true file review and assessment if you've only got files
of,
from
yeah,
one.
one side.
And I tell them all the time that it's not the source of the information, it's the breadth. So I want every interrogatory, I want everything the
yeah.
other parent has ever produced. I
Yeah.
want that first. I want that and every motion, order, everyone. So I want information from their side. And then I used to, I've done them for many of them. I would say the percentages now are probably 20% that it's there and 80% that is
not.
parental alienation.
Oh, that it is.
I've just
Yeah.
gotten better
Yeah.
at weeding out and being able to read through it and say, I'm going to refer you on to somebody else because you can only take so many cases.
Right. Right.
So, but yes, earlier I had a lot more findings of estrangement, of child abuse, and to take a case and work on a file review, and it used to take longer. Now it's less time, just more efficient. And then you come back with the attorney, and because that's who I communicate with, and say, there's clearly child abuse in this situation. If there's child abuse, by definition, people will say, well, there's a hybrid where a parent has contributed and the other parent, they're both contributed.
Right.
By definition, my trainer, Dr. Steve Miller, said that can't happen because if a parent has contributed to the level to justify rejection, then it's child abuse.
Right.
And the other parent is gatekeeping or is inappropriate. But
Right.
first and foremost, you have a case of child abuse. So I find those, and then breaking that to the attorney is a challenge.
I bet. I bet.
If it's a case where you find that there was a contributing factor on the part of the parent that is being allegedly alienated, what do you do from there? What's the solution for the kids?
So contributing factor is the question.
Okay.
Because the question is this parent doing anything differently in that child's life than they were doing the first 10 years when the child was okay with them? So is this still the same parent, still the same issues? Did the parent just get into some depression or some reactivity because the marriage was falling apart and they're doing some deficient parenting and they're what we call the 4 A's, angry, anxious, agitated, or afraid? Are they just, kind of, they're not at their top of their game,
Right.
to say the least? Well, children don't reject parents for that.
Okay.
They don't reject parents. The research tells us that children don't really reject parents for abuse either. It's a very rare child who rejects a parent. That is Dr. Steve Miller and Burnett and Baker's research, very large research study that show adjudicated children pulled out of the homes and put them into foster care.
Right.
None of those children displayed any of the 8 manifestations, and they
So children that were physically abused or sexually abused, even they often don't reject their parent.
not often in this research study and many others, some that Dr. Amy Baker has done, they have discovered, or the findings from the research was that these children, not only did they not reject, but they engaged in what we call attachment enhancing behaviors. They clung to those parents, they made excuses for them, they did anything they could to try to keep those parents in their lives. They didn't have, if they had any of the 8 manifestations, there was very few in the studies and very minor, not the ones that they didn't show up in any of these studies. They didn't have a rejection of a parent for frivolous reasons. They clung to those parents instead. So it's a rare child who will reject a parent. And I forgot the question.
That's perfect. You answered it. Thank you very
No,
much.
yeah, well, and when you find out that it's a situation in it's child abuse or something of that nature, and you have to tell the attorneys, do you give them resources to move forward, or does the attorney just kind of need to figure that out?
No, I make recommendations. So
Okay.
I provide a report, and there are quite honestly attorneys who don't want to report
Right,
because
that's
it's
fair.
discoverable.
Right.
But I do provide a report because that's in my contract that I will provide a report
Right.
and do with it what you will. But the report will say, here are the findings, here's the evidence, blah, blah, blah. And then there's recommendation for anger management, for drug and alcohol testing, and a pathway out. It does not mean that you can't be and have a competent parent and reunify with your child. You just need to work some of those through those issues.
Right.
We are very aware of the controversy around there being domestic violence and child abuse in these cases. So if we see any of that, it's not because of the controversy, but it's because of our dedication to this work that will say this is not a safe parent for this child.
Right.
But you can make him, hopefully, or her become a
Right.
safe parent.
If they're
Right.
willing
Yeah.
to do the work.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it's one of the things that we talk about oftentimes when we have clients come to us. We tell them it's very similar, right? They say the words, they say the buzzwords, they've Googled it, right? They
Right.
know the things to tell me in order for me to believe that they've got a parental alienation case. A lot of times we talk about them. We don't know that yet, and we're not going to use those terms until we do know, right? And we talk about different terms. We talk about refuse, resist contact, right, versus PA and different the scale sort of that. And so we try to explain to them that it's not every case is parental alienation. Um, when we're doing that, what we're trying to do is set expectations for them. And one of the things that we do when we're setting the expectations for the client is we're also trying to help them navigate this. What resources do you provide just for the client? You said earlier that you do the parent coaching and that sort of stuff, and I assume it's applicable to this type of case. What resources do you provide people to help navigate that?
So they'll ask, if I hear you correctly, they'll ask, how can you help me, or what can
Right.
I do?
Yeah.
What are my options?
Yeah.
And I run them through the continuum of options.
Mm-hmm.
The first and the foremost, the first thing you'll be glad to hear this is I tell them always do what your attorney tells you.
Yeah,
So
that's fair.
if I give you some guidance, make sure you ask your attorney about it, because you may have a totally some confidential information with your attorney that he or she understands that I don't. So
Right.
you must run everything by them. I'm going to give you the standard. Now you need to clarify it with your attorney.
Right.
And then I leave that up to you.
Yeah,
But,
that's fair. I
right.
appreciate that.
Right. But I let them know that there is a pretty standard way of approaching this, because you asked about the judges. Well, we know that's going to be an uphill battle, so there's got to be some expert witness on the stand to educate the judges. And if you're not able to, or you have a judge that so many counties people, it is still surprising to me about how little is understood about this issue. And I'm all
Yes.
over the country, like I said, and we're in Austin. There's a
Yep.
lot understood, but not so much elsewhere.
Elsewhere.
Yeah. So I tell them have an expert on the stand, and then there's a way of doing kind of a evaluation or assessment of your case. We do it in 3 different ways. First off is kind of a down and dirty, what we call a poor man's assessment. Is the expert educates the judge about parental alienation, and then your attorney walks me through hypotheticals of your case on the stand, and does this apply, and this apply, and this apply, and then if it does, I can say yes. So that's kind of a on the spot assessment, and you have a judge look at maybe ordering a full assessment or whatever your motion is. The next one is a court ordered parental alienation assessment, and that is we do quite a bit of those. Often a misunderstood assessment, because I can do one in one day. Yeah, not the file review, because that may take a couple weeks after, but there's a very specific way to do an assessment. And again, my training, we haven't talked about my training, is with Dr. Steve Miller, who was a professor at Harvard and at Brown, and taught in clinical reasoning and medical assessment and such. And from that, we learned that, and from Linda Gottlieb, who worked with Dr. Mnuchin, who's the father of family therapy, you use those systems in a way to interview the children, and you do it in one day. It has to be done in one day.
Yeah.
That's because you don't want the children to go home and talk, and for there to be any contamination of anybody's testimony. So
right.
you put those children in a series of family dynamics, cross generational communications with different parents, different configurations, different subsets, and you interview them one at a time, beginning with the younger and one of the parents, and you work your way through the family, and you isolate them each so they can't talk. By the time you get to the end of those subsets, then you have a really good indication about any of the child's manifestations, the parents' alienating behaviors, because children are going to say it. They're going to say it right to that parent. I have them look in the eye and tell your mom or your dad why you don't want to go to their house. And then they tell one parent one thing, then they tell the other parent another thing. And they think, okay, so there's some coaching or something going on
something
here.
there, yeah.
So you can do a parental alienation assessment. You can do it in one day. If you do it in more than one day, you've missed your opportunity. But then you have to add read some of the documentation and then talk to some of the collaterals. And that's a court-ordered assessment. One of the problems with that one is that'll take sometimes a year or two to get ordered from the judge.
Yeah.
And a very long time. And in the meantime, there could be a year or two of psychological maltreatment being done to those children. So it gets more complicated. The other way of doing, I explain to parents, is what we call a forensic file review.
Yeah.
There are principles in custody evaluations. I believe it's in the AFCC. I think that's where it is. Where if you can get the same information from qualified and competent, information, instead of involving the children, interviewing them, that's preferable. So a forensic file review is doing a review of every single thing in the file. And I tell clients, you bring me this huge x-ray, and I'm a radiologist, and I will look and see if there are any hairline fractures. I'll find them if they're there. If it is in your file, I'm going to find it. And that's why I need both sides of the story. I need to be able to do a file review from your ex's point of view, your child's point of view, and your point of view. And you need to bring me all that information, and I will find it. It's going to be in there guaranteed. So there's the on-the-spot assessment, there is the court-ordered assessment, and then there's a forensic file review. And without doing that, there's a fourth way, and it's really an unfortunate way, but it's often one, as I'm sure you know, that families have to go through, is you might have to go to therapy and family therapy and have it fail over and over and over again until you bring it back to the judge and say everything is just getting worse. Because if it's a case of moderate to severe parental alienation, which means you have a moderate to severely alienating parent, and it's showing up in the child's behavior, then that is not going to be successfully treated in traditional outpatient therapy, and it's just going to get worse. And parents will say, why? It'll get worse because if the alienating parent loses traction with that child, they double down on it. If they feel like they're going to lose their case, they'll double down on it. And then they just work on that child. If there's any movement whatsoever, they'll double down on their alienating behaviors, and then it's inevitable that the alienation just progresses.
And so when you start talking about that, are you talking about what often gets ordered, and most people call it reunification therapy? So even that may be a step, but that can then be also harmful.
If it's traditional reunification, in other words, traditional weekly talk therapy, and it has been, you're doing reunification or family therapy, whatever it's called, in the office for 1 or 2 hours a week, while the alienating parent may have over 100 hours a week to abuse the child. And so we know there is a lot of research on why traditional therapy is harmful to children in cases of moderate to severe.
I want to talk real fast about something you mentioned about the forensic file, because I think it's important to understand the depth of what that is. And then I'm going to be very frank with you. I have about 1,000 other questions, and I'm not sure I'm going to get to them all today. And so we're probably going to have you come back. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. I've enjoyed this, and as long as you're enjoying it, I guess. I can't hold you hostage. I won't wait until you have another birthday, though, so we'll come back sooner than that. But I want to talk about the file, the forensic file review, because I know that in the past, without getting into specifics, we've done this, my office has done this with you. And it's not... I think it's important that people understand it's not just, here are some documents. This is every text message that has been sent. Every text message that has been sent between the parents and the children, the parents and both children, or sorry, both parents and the children. This is Our Family Wizard messages, app close messages. This is can be communications with school officials, therapists, doctors, sports, coaches, extracurricular activities.
Neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just voluminous.
Yes.
And we're not even talking about like legal documents or pleadings or anything, deposition transcripts or anything like that. It's so much work. And what I what I want everyone to understand is that it's a lot of work for the client, right? It's one thing for us to take it, organize it, then hand it to you, and then you sort through it and you hand it back to us. But to go get all of that, and it's important that I think that parents that are going through this, they understand you have to document everything, you have to keep everything, and then you have to be willing to undergo sort of this really in-depth sort of opening up of all the wounds and all the really bad things that you don't want to get into, and give it to us so we can see it and then organize it and give it to you so you can do it. Because if not, then you're going to look at the file and go, there's only X, Y, and Z in here. There's only, 50, pieces of data in here that really support this contention, as opposed to 500 or 1,000 or whatever it is. And you've got really concrete evidence of psychological maltreatment or the other, the other sort of diagnosis tools that you need. And so, do you, how, like, what is there a minimum amount? I know that every time we've done it, you've just asked for more. So, and it's, and we're talking about thousands of pages. We're not talking about thousands of, or, 1,000 pages. We're talking thousands, if not tens of thousands of pages of documents. Is there a minimum, or is there a
Everything.
maximum? Just everything.
A minimum is everything you've got.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
and that's what you've always said, and it's always been, and it's a lot. I got to go back to the client multiple times and say I need more, and I need more, and I need more, and it really is it's a lot. Tell me, on the court ordered sort of evaluations, um, how receptive do you find courts to be to that?
Well, that's a good question, because by the time they get to wanting services like ours that I provide, the courts have had it up to here.
Right.
They don't know what to do. There are times all around the country. Again, emphasize that because Austin, the courts are so unique, but where I'll get on the stand and I'll have a 2-hour hearing, and the judge is still asking me questions 6 hours later.
Right.
And then at the end of that, he'll say it's the only coherent, concept that I've heard, and then
Right.
he'll order whatever they're
coming out of
wanting.
it, yeah.
So the courts are receptive to the information if you're able to really present it
Right.
in those. So I think when you have somebody who can really talk about the research and answer some questions for the judges, like they can't make sense. Most of us don't understand that you can weaponize children.
Right.
We don't live in that world.
Right.
We don't understand that you can be vindictive and hurt that other parent with total lack of apathy for your child and how that's going to affect them. And, even parents can't see that, but usually when you get to that level, it's associated with personality disorders, and that's the research. But we don't understand. So it's hard for judges a lot of times, even though they've seen it all in their courtrooms, it's really hard for them to wrap their heads
around it. Yeah,
around,
100%, yeah.
that a mom or a dad can hurt a child in that way.
Right.
And then you go systematically how that happens.
Yeah.
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 And there's a lot of there's a lot of research, but when you break it down to what happens and the vindictiveness, and somebody's been had an affair on somebody and somebody's getting even with them, and they don't mean to be taking out on their kids, they don't even know it, but usually they do, but they weaponize their children, and then a judge begins to connect the dots. So you help the judges with the information and then connect the dots. Then they I've found that for those, they're always grateful. But the glitch with that out of Texas is they have to come to Texas for a court-ordered assessment.
Yeah.
And they do. I've had them come here for an assessment. Back to your question real quick about the more information. It could be overstated how important text messages are, because there are apps that you can run your phone through, and everything is in the cloud now, so it's all up in the cloud.
Yeah.
I want text messages that go back 2-3 years before you separated.
Rated, yeah.
I want to know what's going on. Did your ex complain about child abuse then? Did your ex, or did you have just a routine, you want to pick up
Right.
McDonald's for dinner kind of text? I want to see what your relationship was like, and then what happened and what it's like now. Because when you look at that, and then the other thing I do is overlay what mom is saying to the daughter here, while she's telling dad here, she's telling the daughter hide behind the school and telling dad she's homesick, all
Right.
at the same time. That's pretty concrete evidence. So
That's
those
right.
texts are really important.
I want to, like I said, I can't wait to have you back. It's gonna be. I've really enjoyed this. In the meantime, how can people get a hold of you?
My website is lorettamaase.com.
And that's MAASE.
Correct.
And you got some new information on the website too. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
I don't know what you're referring to.
I thought I thought I heard the other day that
It's all-
you had some new information about parental alienation you put up on the website.
Oh, right. So I'm writing a lot of articles, new
Okay.
articles on parental alienation, and there's been a lot of controversy about reunification, what reunification is, about those of us who provide reunification, what a camp is. Never heard of a camp before.
Right,
Don't
right.
have a camp. Don't know what that means. We're a tightly regulated intensive family therapy program. So there's a whole lot of information about the controversy about the definition of parental alienation, and a lot more about the DSM-5. So
Okay.
we're writing articles regularly, almost daily, and getting them on the website.
Fantastic. And if they want to contact you to do an assessment or to talk about this, or if they need help, they can go to the website and get that.
Yes.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Loretta, I greatly appreciate you being here today. It's been fantastic. Guys, thanks for hanging out with us today on episode 4 of Cases and Cocktail, and stay tuned for episode 5 coming up next week.